Chapter 4. In the course of the next day, the harmony of our little family was disturbed by something like a quarrel between George and Edward. The former, though he loved his brother dearly, had found it quite too great a sacrifice of his own enjoyments, to spend all his playtime in a darkened chamber. Edward, on the other hand, was inclined to be despotic. He felt as if his bandaged eyes entitled him to demand that everybody, who enjoyed the blessing of sight, should contribute to his comfort and amusement. He therefore insisted that George, instead of going out to play at football, should join with himself and Emily in a game of questions and answers. George resolutely refused, and ran out of the house. He did not revisit Edward's chamber till the evening, when he stole in, looking confused, yet somewhat sullen, and sat down beside his father's chair. It was evident, by a motion of Edward's head and a slight trembling of his lips, that he was aware of George's entrance, though his footsteps had been almost inaudible. Emily, with her serious and earnest little face, looked from one to the other, as if she longed to be a messenger of peace between them. Mr. Temple, without seeming to notice any of these circumstances, began a story. Samuel Johnson, born 1709. Died 1784. "Sam," said Mr. Michael Johnson of Lichfield, one morning, "I am very feeble and ailing today. You must go to Uttoxeter in my stead, and tend the bookstall in the market-place there." This was spoken, above 100 years ago, by an elderly man, who had once been a thriving bookseller at Lichfield, in England. Being now in reduced circumstances, he was forced to go, every market day, and sell books at a stall, in the neighbouring village of Uttoxeter. His son, to whom Mr. Johnson spoke, was a great boy of very singular aspect. He had an intelligent face, but it was seamed and distorted by a scrofulous humour, which affected his eyes so badly, that sometimes he was almost blind. Owing to the same cause, his head would often shake with a tremulous motion, as if he were afflicted with the palsy. When Sam was an infant, the famous Queen Anne had tried to cure him of this disease, by laying her royal hands upon his head. But though the touch of a king or queen was supposed to be a certain remedy for scrofula, it produced no good effect upon Sam Johnson. At the time which we speak of, the poor lad was not very well dressed, and wore shoes from which his toes peeped out, for his old father had barely the means of supporting his wife and children. But, poor as the family were, young Sam Johnson had as much pride as any nobleman's son in England. The fact was, he felt conscious of uncommon sense and ability, which, in his own opinion, entitled him to great respect from the world. Perhaps he would have been glad, if grown people had treated him as reverentially as his school-fellows did. 3 of them were accustomed to come for him, every morning, and while he sat upon the back of one, the 2 others supported him on each side, and thus he rode to school in triumph. Being a personage of so much importance, Sam could not bear the idea of standing all day in Uttoxeter market, offering books to the rude and ignorant country people. Doubtless he felt the more reluctant on account of his shabby clothes, and the disorder of his eyes, and the tremulous motion of his head. When Mr. Michael Johnson spoke, Sam pouted, and made an indistinct grumbling in his throat, then he looked his old father in the face, and answered him loudly and deliberately. "Sir," said he, "I will not go to Uttoxeter market." Mr. Johnson had seen a great deal of the lad's obstinacy ever since his birth, and while Sam was younger, the old gentleman had probably used the rod, whenever occasion seemed to require. But he was now too feeble, and too much out of spirits, to contend with this stubborn and violent-tempered boy. He therefore gave up the point at once, and prepared to go to Uttoxeter himself. "Well, Sam," said Mr. Johnson, as he took his hat and staff, "if, for the sake of your foolish pride, you can suffer your poor sick father to stand all day in the noise and confusion of the market, when he ought to be in his bed, I have no more to say. But you will think of this, Sam, when I am dead and gone." So the poor old man, perhaps with a tear in his eye, but certainly with sorrow in his heart, set forth towards Uttoxeter. The grey-haired, feeble, melancholy Michael Johnson. How sad a thing it was, that he should be forced to go, in his sickness, and toil for the support of an ungrateful son, who was too proud to do anything for his father, or his mother, or himself. Sam looked after Mr. Johnson, with a sullen countenance, till he was out of sight. But when the old man's figure, as he went stooping along the street, was no more to be seen, the boy's heart began to smite him. He had a vivid imagination, and it tormented him with the image of his father, standing in the market-place of Uttoxeter and offering his books to the noisy crowd around him. Sam seemed to behold him, arranging his literary merchandise upon the stall in such a way as was best calculated to attract notice. Here was Addison's Spectator, a long row of little volumes, here was Pope's translation of the Iliad and Odyssey, here were Dryden's poems, or those of Prior. Here, likewise, were Gulliver's Travels, and a variety of little gilt-covered children's books, such as Tom Thumb, Jack the Giant Queller, Mother Goose's Melodies, and others which our great-grandparents used to read in their childhood. And here were sermons for the pious, and pamphlets for the politicians, and ballads, some merry and some dismal ones, for the country people to sing. Sam, in imagination, saw his father offer these books, pamphlets, and ballads, now to the rude yeoman, who perhaps could not read a word, now to the country squires, who cared for nothing but to hunt hares and foxes, now to the children, who chose to spend their coppers for sugar plums or gingerbread, rather than for picture books. And if Mr. Johnson should sell a book to man, woman, or child, it would cost him an hour's talk to get a profit of only sixpence. My poor father, thought Sam to himself. How his head will ache, and how heavy his heart will be. I am almost sorry that I did not do as he bade me. Then the boy went to his mother, who was busy about the house. She did not know of what had passed between Mr. Johnson and Sam. "Mother," said he, "did you think father seemed very ill today?" "Yes, Sam," answered his mother, turning with a flushed face from the fire, where she was cooking their scanty dinner. "Your father did look very ill, and it is a pity he did not send you to Uttoxeter in his stead. You are a great boy now, and would rejoice, I am sure, to do something for your poor father, who has done so much for you." The lad made no reply. But again his imagination set to work, and conjured up another picture of poor Michael Johnson. He was standing in the hot sunshine of the market-place, and looking so weary, sick, and disconsolate, that the eyes of all the crowd were drawn to him. Had this old man no son, the people would say among themselves, who might have taken his place at the bookstall, while the father kept his bed? And perhaps, but this was a terrible thought for Sam, perhaps his father would faint away, and fall down in the market-place, with his grey hair in the dust, and his venerable face as deathlike as that of a corpse. And there would be the bystanders gazing earnestly at Mr. Johnson, and whispering, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" And Sam shuddered, as he repeated to himself, "Is he dead? Oh, I have been a cruel son," thought he, within his own heart. "God forgive me! God forgive me!" But God could not yet forgive him, for he was not truly penitent. Had he been so, he would have hastened away that very moment to Uttoxeter, and have fallen at his father's feet, even in the midst of the crowded market-place. There he would have confessed his fault, and besought Mr. Johnson to go home, and leave the rest of the day's work to him. But such was Sam's pride and natural stubbornness, that he could not bring himself to this humiliation. Yet he ought to have done so, for his own sake, and for his father's sake, and for God's sake. After sunset, old Michael Johnson came slowly home, and sat down in his customary chair. He said nothing to Sam, nor do I know that a single word ever passed between them, on the subject of the son's disobedience. In a few years, his father died and left Sam to fight his way through the world by himself. It would make our story much too long were I to tell you even a few of the remarkable events of Sam's life. Moreover, there is the less need of this, because many books have been written about that poor boy, and the fame that he acquired, and all that he did or talked of doing, after he came to be a man. But one thing I must not neglect to say. From his boyhood upward, until the latest day of his life, he never forgot the story of Uttoxeter market. Often when he was a scholar of the University of Oxford, or master of an academy at Edial, or a writer for the London booksellers, in all his poverty and toil, and in all his success, while he was walking the streets without a shilling to buy food, or when the greatest men of England were proud to feast him at their table, still that heavy and remorseful thought came back to him, I was cruel to my poor father in his illness. Many and many a time, awake or in his dreams, he seemed to see old Michael Johnson, standing in the dust and confusion of the market-place, and pressing his withered hand to his forehead as if it ached. Alas, my dear children, it is a sad thing to have such a thought as this to bear us company through life. Though the story was but half finished, yet, as it was longer than usual, Mr. Temple here made a short pause. He perceived that Emily was in tears, and Edward turned his half-veiled face towards the speaker, with an air of great earnestness and interest. As for George, he had withdrawn into the dusky shadow behind his father's chair. Chapter 5. In a few moments Mr. Temple resumed the story, as follows. Samuel Johnson, continued. Well, my children, 50 years had passed away since young Sam Johnson had shown himself so hard-hearted towards his father. It was now market day in the village of Uttoxeter. In the street of the village, you might see cattle dealers with cows and oxen for sale, and pig drovers, with herds of squeaking swine, and farmers, with cartloads of cabbages, turnips, onions, and all other produce of the soil. Now and then a farmer's red-faced wife trotted along on horseback, with butter and cheese in 2 large panniers. The people of the village, with country squires and other visitors from the neighbourhood, walked hither and thither, trading, jesting, quarrelling, and making just such a bustle as their fathers and grandfathers had made half a century before. In one part of the street, there was a puppet show, with a ridiculous Merry Andrew, who kept both grown people and children in a roar of laughter. On the opposite side was the old stone church of Uttoxeter, with ivy climbing up its walls, and partly obscuring its Gothic windows. There was a clock in the grey tower of the ancient church, and the hands on the dial plate had now almost reached the hour of noon. At this busiest hour of the market, a strange old gentleman was seen making his way among the crowd. He was very tall and bulky, and wore a brown coat and small clothes, with black worsted stockings and buckled shoes. On his head was a three-cornered hat, beneath which a bushy grey wig thrust itself out, all in disorder. The old gentleman elbowed the people aside, and forced his way through the midst of them with a singular kind of gait, rolling his body hither and thither, so that he needed twice as much room as any other person there. "Make way, sir," he would cry out, in a loud, harsh voice, when somebody happened to interrupt his progress. "Sir, you intrude your person into the public thoroughfare. What a queer old fellow this is," muttered the people among themselves, hardly knowing whether to laugh or to be angry. But, when they looked into the venerable stranger's face, not the most thoughtless among them dared to offer him the least impertinence. Though his features were scarred and distorted with the scrofula, and though his eyes were dim and bleared, yet there was something of authority and wisdom in his look, which impressed them all with awe. So they stood aside to let him pass, and the old gentleman made his way across the market-place, and paused near the corner of the ivy-mantled church. Just as he reached it, the clock struck 12. On the very spot of ground, where the stranger now stood, some aged people remembered that old Michael Johnson had formerly kept his bookstall. The little children, who had once bought picture books of him, were grandfathers now. "Yes, here is the very spot," muttered the old gentleman to himself. There this unknown personage took his stand, and removed the three-cornered hat from his head. It was the busiest hour of the day. What with the hum of human voices, the lowing of cattle, the squeaking of pigs, and the laughter caused by the Merry Andrew, the market-place was in very great confusion. But the stranger seemed not to notice it, any more than if the silence of a desert were around him. He was wrapped in his own thoughts. Sometimes he raised his furrowed brow to heaven, as if in prayer, sometimes he bent his head, as if an insupportable weight of sorrow were upon him. It increased the awfulness of his aspect that there was a motion of his head, and an almost continual tremor throughout his frame, with singular twitchings and contortions of his features. The hot sun blazed upon his unprotected head, but he seemed not to feel its fervor. A dark cloud swept across the sky, and rain-drops pattered into the market-place, but the stranger heeded not the shower. The people began to gaze at the mysterious old gentleman, with superstitious fear and wonder. Who could he be? Whence did he come? Wherefore was he standing bareheaded in the market-place? Even the school boys left the Merry Andrew, and came to gaze, with wide-open eyes, at this tall, strange-looking old man. There was a cattle drover in the village, who had recently made a journey to the Smithfield market, in London. No sooner had this man thrust his way through the throng, and taken a look at the unknown personage, than he whispered to one of his acquaintances, "I say, neighbour Hutchins, would ye like to know who this old gentleman is?" "Aye, that I would," replied neighbour Hutchins, "for a queerer chap I never saw in my life. Somehow, it makes me feel small to look at him." "He's more than a common man, you may well say so," answered the cattle drover. "Why, that's the famous Dr. Samuel Johnson, who, they say, is the greatest and learnedest man in England. I saw him in London streets, walking with one Mr. Boswell. Yes, the poor boy, the friendless Sam, with whom we began our story, had become the famous Dr. Samuel Johnson. He was universally acknowledged as the wisest man and greatest writer in all England. He had given shape and permanence to his native language, by his dictionary. Thousands upon thousands of people had read his Idler, his Rambler, and his Rasselas. Noble and wealthy men, and beautiful ladies, deemed it their highest privilege to be his companions. Even the King of Great Britain had sought his acquaintance, and told him what an honour he considered it, that such a man had been born in his dominions. He was now at the summit of literary renown. But all his fame could not extinguish the bitter remembrance, which had tormented him through life. Never, never, had he forgotten his father's sorrowful and upbraiding look. Never, though the old man's troubles had been over so many years, had he forgiven himself for inflicting such a pang upon his heart. And now, in his old age, he had come hither to do penance, by standing at noon-day in the market-place of Uttoxeter, on the very spot where Michael Johnson had once kept his bookstall. The aged and illustrious man had done what the poor boy refused to do. By thus expressing his deep repentance and humiliation of heart, he hoped to gain peace of conscience, and the forgiveness of God. "My dear children, if you have grieved, I will not say, your parents, but, if you have grieved the heart of any human being, who has a claim upon your love, then think of Samuel Johnson's penance. Will it not be better to redeem the error now, than to endure the agony of remorse for 50 years? Would you not rather say to a brother, I have erred. Forgive me, than perhaps to go hereafter, and shed bitter tears upon his grave?" Hardly was the story concluded, when George hastily arose, and Edward likewise, stretching forth his hands into the darkness that surrounded him, to find his brother. Both accused themselves of unkindness, each besought the other's forgiveness, and having done so, the trouble of their hearts vanished away like a dream. "I am glad. I am so glad," said Emily, in a low, earnest voice. "Now I shall sleep quietly tonight, my sweet child," thought Mrs. Temple, as she kissed her. "Mayest thou never know how much strife there is on earth. It would cost thee many a night's rest."